I heard him before I saw him. His voice carried from the gate area all the way into the cockpit, loud enough to cut through the pre-flight checklist I was running with my first officer. He wanted to know where the captain was, needed to speak with someone in charge, had an important question that couldn't wait. The gate agent's response was too quiet to hear, but his reaction wasn't. He insisted he needed to speak with the captain immediately, that this was urgent, that he'd been flying for 30 years and knew his rights as a passenger. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. My first officer glanced up from his tablet where he'd been reviewing the weather. We'd flown together enough times for him to recognize the tone, the particular edge that usually meant trouble before we'd even pushed back from the gate. I finished checking the fuel calculations and stood up. The gate agent appeared in the cockpit doorway, her expression apologetic in that way that meant she'd tried to handle it herself and failed. She explained that a passenger was demanding to speak with the captain. He was insistent, wouldn't board until his concerns were addressed. I told her I'd come out and asked what his concerns were specifically. She hesitated, then said he hadn't actually specified. Just kept repeating that he needed to talk to whoever was in charge. Walking through the aircraft toward the gate, I could see him standing near the podium. Late 50s, business suit, the kind of posture that suggested he was used to being listened to. He was talking to another passenger, gesturing toward the aircraft. When he saw me approaching in my uniform, his expression shifted into something like relief, mixed with continued irritation. I introduced myself as the captain and asked what I could help him with. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes moving from my face to my stripes. Then he asked where the actual captain was, said he needed to speak with the person who'd be flying the plane, that this was a serious matter. The gate agent started to interject, but I held up a hand. I told him I was the captain, that I'd be flying to Chicago today. Asked again what his concern was. He made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scoff, said he'd been flying this route for work every week for the past 5 years, had probably taken this exact flight 100 times, and had never once had a woman pilot. Wanted to know if this was some kind of training flight. Asked if there was a more experienced pilot who'd be supervising, if the airline was using revenue flights to give inexperienced pilots practice hours. I kept my voice level and explained I'd been a commercial pilot for 9 years, had over 8,000 flight hours. He interrupted before I finished, said that wasn't what he was asking, that he understood I might be qualified on paper, but wanted to know if someone more experienced would actually be making the critical decisions. Said he had nothing against women personally, but that flying was different, required certain capabilities, involved life-or-death choices that couldn't be made emotionally. The gate agent's face had gone red. A few other passengers waiting to board had stopped to watch, their expressions ranging from curious to uncomfortable. I told him every pilot in this airline met the same standards, underwent the same training, passed the same tests. That gender had no bearing on capability, that I'd be the pilot in command today, and if he wasn't comfortable with that, the gate agent could help him rebook on a later flight. He said he'd paid for this flight, had a meeting in Chicago he couldn't miss, that it wasn't reasonable to expect him to change his plans because the airline had made questionable staffing decisions, that he was simply trying to ensure his safety, which was his right as a passenger, that any reasonable person would have the same concerns seeing a woman in the captain's seat for the first time. I felt my hands forming fists at my sides and consciously relaxed them. Explained that I flew this route regularly, that dozens of passengers flew with me every week without incident, that my safety record was spotless. He asked how long I'd been a captain specifically, and when I told him 3 years, he shook his head like that proved his point. Said 3 years wasn't very long, that the male captains he usually flew with typically had decades of experience, that it seemed like the airline was prioritizing diversity over passenger safety. Behind him, a woman spoke up. She wanted to know if there was actually a problem with the flight crew, if she should be worried. The man seized on this, turned to address her and the other waiting passengers. Said he wasn't trying to cause trouble, was just asking reasonable questions, that they all had a right to know who was flying them and whether proper safety protocols were being followed. The gate agent reached for her phone, probably calling for a supervisor or security. I told the man he had 2 choices, board the aircraft and take his seat, or step aside and rebook. That I wasn't going to stand here defending my qualifications to someone who'd already decided not to accept them regardless of what I said. That we had a schedule to keep and other passengers waiting to board. He said I was being defensive, that this was exactly the kind of emotional reaction he was concerned about, that a real captain would understand his legitimate safety concerns instead of taking them personally. That my reaction was proving his point about women not being suited for command positions. Several other passengers had stopped now, forming a loose semicircle, watching this play out like street theater. A security officer arrived, quickly assessed the situation, asked the man to step aside to discuss his concerns. The man protested that he was being singled out for asking questions, that other passengers clearly had the same worries, that it was discrimination to remove him for expressing legitimate safety concerns. The security officer's voice stayed calm and professional as he explained that the captain had asked him to move and that he needed to comply. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. The man finally stepped aside, still protesting, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong. I turned and walked back toward the aircraft, feeling the weight of all those passenger eyes on my back, knowing that everything he'd said was still hanging in the air, still planting doubt in minds that had been perfectly comfortable 5 minutes ago. The gate agent followed me, apologizing profusely, saying she should have called security immediately. Back in the cockpit, my first officer asked if I was okay. I said I was fine and returned to the pre-flight checklist, forcing my mind back to numbers and procedures. He pointed out that the passenger was completely out of line, that I'd handled it professionally, that most of the waiting passengers had looked uncomfortable with the confrontation rather than supportive of it. I appreciated him saying it, but didn't particularly want to discuss it further. Wanted to just fly the plane, do my job, prove through action rather than argument. Boarding resumed 20 minutes later. I could hear the passengers moving through the cabin, the usual sounds of overhead bins and seat assignments and families settling in. Could also hear the murmur of conversation, lower and more extensive than usual, the kind of collective whispering that meant people were discussing something. Discussing me, most likely. Wondering if that man had a point. The lead flight attendant came to the cockpit and quietly told me that several passengers had asked her about the situation, wanted to know if everything was okay with the flight crew, if there were any safety issues they should be aware of. She'd assured them everything was fine, that I was highly qualified, that the removed passenger had been disruptive, but she could tell they were still uncertain, still processing, still influenced by what they'd witnessed. I asked if anyone had requested to deplane. She said no, but that a few passengers seemed nervous, kept glancing toward the cockpit, asking questions about the flight time and weather conditions that suggested underlying anxiety. I told her to let them know I'd been flying commercially for 9 years without incident, that today would be no different, that we'd arrive in Chicago safely and on time. After she left, I sat there for a moment with my hands on the yoke, feeling the solid reality of it, the physical connection to the aircraft. This part never doubted me. The instruments didn't care about my gender. The flight controls responded to input regardless of who provided it. The physics of flight were neutral, indifferent, pure. Up here, competence was measurable. We finished the pre-flight and received our clearance. I made the standard announcement, keeping my voice steady and professional, welcoming everyone aboard, providing the flight time and weather information. Could almost feel the passengers listening differently, evaluating my voice, my tone, my words, searching for some evidence that would either confirm or refute that removed passengers' concerns. Every word felt weighted. Pushback was smooth. I started the engines, felt them spool up, ran through the after-start checklist with my first officer. Our coordination was automatic, practiced, the result of years of training and procedure. He handled the radio calls while I taxied, the aircraft responding precisely to every input, exactly as it should. This was what I was good at. This was what mattered. The taxi to the runway took 8 minutes. I spent them reviewing the departure procedure, checking the flight management system, monitoring the other aircraft on the taxiway. Spent them not thinking about that passenger, not replaying his words, not wondering how many people in the cabin behind me were still questioning whether they were safe. Spent them doing my job. Tower cleared us for takeoff. I taxied onto the runway, advanced the throttles, felt the acceleration build, called out the speeds as we reached them, felt my first officer monitoring, confirming, backing me up. At rotation speed, I pulled back smoothly and the nose lifted, the sensation of the wheels leaving the ground, the moment when we stopped being a vehicle and became an aircraft. When we flew. The climb was smooth. I retracted the gear and flaps, established the climb power, followed the departure procedure exactly. The city fell away below us, the airport shrinking, the world expanding. Up here, the physics were simple, honest, indifferent to everything except skill and knowledge and attention. Up here, I was just a pilot doing what pilots do. We leveled off at 37,000 feet. I engaged the autopilot and sat back, monitoring the instruments, checking the fuel flow and engine parameters. Everything normal. Everything as it should be. My first officer was reviewing the arrival procedures for Chicago, making notes on his kneeboard. The cockpit felt separate from the rest of the aircraft, isolated, protected. Our own small world where things made sense. About 40 minutes into the flight, the lead flight attendant returned. She reported that the cabin was mostly settled, that service was proceeding normally. but that she wanted me to know that a few passengers were still expressing concerns. One woman had asked if there was any way to know the pilot's actual flight hours, if that information was public record. A man in first class wanted to know if the first officer was experienced enough to take over if necessary. I told her to inform them that both pilots were fully qualified, that we flew together regularly, that their safety was never in question. She nodded and left, but I could see she was frustrated, exhausted by having to constantly reassure passengers about something that should never have been a question in the first place. The removed passenger had poisoned the cabin, planted seeds of doubt that would persist the entire flight. My first officer mentioned that he'd never had passengers question his qualifications, never had anyone demand to speak to a more experienced pilot, never had to justify his presence in the cockpit. Said it matter-of-factly without judgment, just acknowledging the reality. I told him I knew that this was normal for me, that I'd learned to expect it, that it was exhausting but manageable. We flew in silence for a while. I monitored the weather ahead, checked our fuel burn against the flight plan, made minor adjustments to our route to avoid some building cumulus clouds. The work was methodical, calming, familiar. This was the part of the job that made sense, that had clear right answers, that rewarded skill and attention and care. Chicago approach began vectoring us for the arrival about 90 minutes into the flight. I reviewed the approach briefing with my first officer, confirmed the runway in use, checked the weather at the airport. Winds were light, visibility was good, conditions were ideal. I would fly the approach manually, wanted to feel the aircraft, wanted the direct connection between my hands and the machine. The descent was smooth. I followed approach controls instructions precisely, maintained the assigned speeds and altitudes, configured the aircraft for landing at the appropriate points. Everything by the book. Final approach was stable. I was on speed, on glide slope, making small corrections to account for the light crosswind. The aircraft felt solid beneath me, responsive, predictable. At 500 feet, I heard the call out, confirmed we were stabilized, continued the descent. The runway grew larger, the touchdown zone markers becoming clear and distinct. At 50 feet, I began the flare, gradually raising the nose, reducing the descent rate, feeling for the precise moment when the wheels would touch. The mains contacted the runway so gently I barely felt it. One of those landings where the transition from flight to ground is nearly imperceptible. The kind of landing that demonstrated skill, that proved competence, that answered questions without words. My first officer commented on the smoothness as I deployed the thrust reversers and began braking. I acknowledged it but felt no particular satisfaction. Good landings were normal, expected, routine. This was what I did every day. The fact that it might prove something to the passengers in the cabin, might ease their concerns, might validate their trust, didn't change the fundamental reality. We taxied to the gate and completed the shutdown checklist. The lead flight attendant appeared and mentioned that several passengers had commented on the smooth landing, that the cabin mood seemed much more relaxed now, that people were gathering their things and preparing to deplane with the normal end-of-flight energy, rather than the nervous tension that had persisted earlier. I stayed in the cockpit while the passengers deplaned, could hear them moving through the cabin, their conversations and footsteps, the sounds gradually fading as the aircraft emptied. Sat there for an extra moment in the quiet, in the space where I belonged, where I was never questioned, never doubted, never asked to prove myself beyond the actual work. Walking through the terminal, I passed clusters of passengers from my flight. Some glanced at me, recognition in their eyes. A few nodded, offered small smiles. One woman approached and said she wanted to apologize for not speaking up earlier, said that man at the gate had been completely out of line, that she should have said something in the moment. I told her it was fine, that I appreciated it, that these situations were uncomfortable for everyone. She continued, said she had a daughter who wanted to be a pilot, that seeing me in command meant something, that she was sorry my competence had been questioned when male pilots never face that scrutiny. I thanked her and moved on, uncomfortable with being made into a symbol, with carrying the weight of representation on top of just trying to do my job. Wanted to just be a pilot, not a statement, not an example, not a validation of possibility. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now to stay updated on your phone. The crew hotel was downtown, a short shuttle ride from the airport. I checked in and went straight to my room, dropped my bags, sat on the bed. The exhaustion wasn't physical. The flying had been easy, routine, well within my capabilities. But everything around the flying, everything that shouldn't have been necessary, had drained something from me. My phone showed several missed calls and messages, one from my airline's chief pilot office saying they'd been informed of the incident, that the passenger had been banned from future flights, that they supported me fully. One from the union representative, asking if I wanted to file a formal complaint or needed any support. One from my sister, who somehow already knew what had happened, asking if I was okay. I responded to the work messages with brief confirmations, told my sister I was fine. Then I ordered room service and turned on the television, needing background noise, needing distraction, needing to not think about that man's face when he'd asked where the actual captain was, about the way he'd said it, about the certainty in his voice that I couldn't possibly be qualified. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in the dark hotel room listening to Chicago outside the window, traffic and sirens and the ambient noise of a city that never quite stopped. Kept replaying moments from the day, thinking of better responses I could have given, wondering if I'd handled it correctly, if I should have been more forceful or less defensive or just different somehow. But the reality was that nothing I'd said would have changed his mind. He'd decided before speaking to me that a woman couldn't be a qualified captain, and no amount of credentials or experience would alter that fundamental belief. The only thing that had changed was that his doubt had spread to other passengers, had created uncertainty where none should have existed, had made my job harder in ways that had nothing to do with actually flying the aircraft. The alarm woke me at 6. I showered and dressed, put on the uniform with its captain's stripes, looked at myself in the mirror. The same person who'd flown perfectly yesterday, who'd landed smoothly. The same person who'd been questioned and doubted and challenged before even starting the engines. Both things true simultaneously. Impossible to reconcile. The return flight to Denver was scheduled for 9 a.m. I arrived at the airport early, went through security, walked to the gate. My first officer from yesterday was there, along with a different lead flight attendant. They greeted me normally, no mention of the previous day's incident, just standard pre-flight coordination. Professional courtesy or deliberate avoidance, I couldn't tell. Didn't particularly matter. Boarding began on time. I watched the passengers file past on the security cameras, the usual mix of business travelers and families and students. No one stopped to question my qualifications. No one demanded to speak to a more experienced pilot. No one created a scene. Just normal boarding, normal people, normal flight. The way it should be. We pushed back and started engines. I taxied to the runway, took off, climbed to cruise altitude. Everything routine, everything smooth, everything exactly as it should be. The passengers in the cabin probably weren't thinking about who was flying them, weren't worried about qualifications or experience or gender, were just reading or sleeping or working, trusting the process. That was the strange part. Most flights were like this. Most passengers never questioned, never doubted, never cared as long as they arrived safely. But the ones who did question created disproportionate impact, required disproportionate energy, left disproportionate marks. One vocal doubter could poison an entire cabin, could create stress that persisted long after the actual confrontation ended. The flight to Denver was uneventful. Good weather, light traffic, smooth air. I flew the approach manually again, landed gently, taxied to the gate. The lead flight attendant thanked me for a great flight, said the passengers had been pleasant and easy. Just another day at work. Just another successful trip. Walking through the Denver terminal toward the parking garage, I passed dozens of other pilots. Some I knew, most I didn't. We nodded at each other in that way colleagues do, acknowledging shared experience. None of them had probably been questioned about their qualifications today. None of them had probably spent emotional energy defending their right to sit in the captain's seat. I drove home through familiar streets, the same route I'd driven hundreds of times, pulled into my driveway, sat in the car for a moment before going inside. Tomorrow I'd have another flight. Maybe it would be smooth. Maybe someone would question my credentials. No way to predict. No way to prepare beyond just continuing to be good at the job. Inside, I changed out of my uniform and hung it in the closet. Captain's stripes on the shoulders, wings on the chest. Symbols that meant something concrete. Training, testing, hours, experience, capability. Symbols that some people looked right past, seeing only what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. My phone buzzed with a message from my first officer. Brief, simple, saying it had been good flying with me, that he'd be happy to crew with me again anytime. Small gesture, but it mattered. Acknowledgement from someone who actually understood what the job entailed, who judged based on performance rather than preconception. The next day would come, and the day after that. More flights, more passengers, more chances for someone to question or doubt or challenge, but also more chances to fly well, to land smoothly, to demonstrate through action what words could never quite convince. More chances to do the job I'd trained for, worked for, earned the right to do. The uniform would go back on. The pre-flight checklist would be run. The engines would start. The aircraft would respond to my inputs exactly as it always did, indifferent to everything except skill and knowledge. And that would have to be enough. The flying itself, the actual work, the pure mechanical reality of being good at what I did. Everything else was noise. Exhausting, frustrating, unjust noise, but still just noise. The flying was what mattered. The flying was what I controlled. The flying was where I belonged, where I'd always belonged, regardless of who questioned it. Tomorrow would bring another gate, another cockpit, another chance to prove what shouldn't need proving. But I'd be there, with my stripes and my hours and my capability, ready to fly, ready to demonstrate, ready to be exactly what I'd always been, a pilot who happened to be questioned more than most. The doubt would come again, from passengers, from colleagues, from strangers who couldn't reconcile their expectations with reality. And I'd handle it the same way I always did, with professionalism, with competence, with the quiet certainty that came from knowing I'd earned every stripe on my shoulder through skill rather than concession. The morning would come too soon. Another briefing, another aircraft, another set of passengers who might trust or might question. The routine would continue because the job demanded it. Because walking away would mean letting the doubters win, would mean accepting their assessment over my demonstrated reality. And that wasn't an option I'd ever seriously considered. The sky would still be there tomorrow. The aircraft would still respond. The physics would still be honest. And I'd still be capable, still be qualified, still be exactly what I'd worked years to become. A captain. Not a female captain. Not a diversity hire. Not a political statement. Just a captain who flew well, landed smoothly, and brought passengers home safely. That's what the job was. That's what I did. And that's what I'd keep doing. One flight at a time. One perfect approach at a time. One smooth landing at a time. Until the questions stopped mattering. Until the doubt became background noise. Until the only thing that counted was the flying itself, pure and simple and honest. The way it should have been from the beginning. The way it would eventually be if I just kept showing up, kept proving it, kept being undeniably good at what I did. The clock showed late evening. Tomorrow's trip sheet was already loaded on my phone. Another early departure, another route, another chance. I set my alarm and turned off the lights. The uniform hung ready in the closet. The flight bag sat packed by the door. Everything prepared, everything routine. Just another day of being a pilot. Just another opportunity to demonstrate that the stripes meant exactly what they were supposed to mean, regardless of who wore them or who questioned them. The doubt would always be there, lurking at gates and in briefing rooms and in the minds of passengers who decided what a captain should look like before ever seeing me. But so would the capability. So would the training. So would the thousands of hours and the perfect approaches and the smooth landings that proved, over and over, that I belonged exactly where I was. In the left seat, in command, flying.